11:47 p.m. The voice on the line was wrong. All wrong. 7 red doors, the caller whispered into David Matthews' ear. Children crying behind each one. David's hand froze over his laptop keyboard. 3 years of safe online therapy sessions, and this anonymous client just described the signature of a serial killer. "Tell me about these doors," David said, reaching for a phone he'd sworn never to touch again. His old FBI instincts screamed one terrifying truth. This wasn't a dream. This was a hunting list. David closed his laptop with the kind of careful precision that came from 3 years of pretending his hands didn't shake anymore. The modest 2-bedroom apartment felt smaller in the darkness, shadows stretching across walls lined with Emma's crayon drawings and participation ribbons from school science fairs. He moved through the routine that had kept them both alive this long, checking locks, drawing curtains, setting the security system he'd installed himself. The coffee mug on the kitchen counter still held the faint outline of lipstick from 3 years ago, a ghost he couldn't bring himself to wash away. Emma's door stood slightly ajar, the way she liked it since the nightmares started. 8 years old and already carrying weight no child should bear, she slept clutching a stuffed elephant that had belonged to her mother. David paused in the doorway, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, counting each one like a prayer. His phone buzzed against his hip, a text from the local precinct. Another missing child case, the 3rd this month. He deleted it without reading the details. The world could burn around them, and David Matthews wouldn't lift a finger to stop it. Not anymore. Not when lifting that finger had cost him everything that mattered. He settled into his desk chair and opened a new client file, forcing his mind back to safer territory. Online therapy sessions paid the bills and kept his psychology license active, but more importantly, they kept him hidden. His computer chimed softly. New appointment request for tomorrow morning. Single mother, recent divorce, struggling with anxiety. Safe, predictable, nothing that would trigger the part of his brain that could read killers like children's books. He accepted the appointment and was reaching for the power button when another message appeared. His blood turned to ice water. The same anonymous caller from earlier had sent a single line of text. The first door opened tomorrow at dawn. The knock on his door came at 7:15 a.m., sharp and professional in a way that made David's coffee mug pause halfway to his lips. Emma sat at the kitchen table, methodically eating cereal while sketching in her notebook, another habit born from too much silence in their small world. Through the peephole, David saw a woman in a crisp FBI windbreaker, her dark hair pulled back severely, badge gleaming like a warning. He opened the door to find Dr. Sarah Chen standing on his doorstep, with the kind of confidence that came from years of being the smartest person in most rooms. She was younger than he'd expected, probably early 30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a mouth set in a line that suggested she didn't hear no very often. What caught him off guard wasn't her professional demeanor or the file folder tucked under her arm. It was the flicker of something personal in her expression when their eyes met. "Dr. Matthews," she said, and there was a slight hesitation before his name, as if she'd practiced saying it. "I'm Agent Chen, FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit. I need your help with a case." She glanced past him toward Emma, who was now openly staring from the kitchen table. "Perhaps we could speak privately?" David stepped onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind him, immediately regretting the decision, as morning air cut through his thin t-shirt. Sarah's presence felt like gravity, pulling at memories he'd worked hard to bury. There was something familiar about her that he couldn't place, something that made his carefully constructed walls feel suddenly fragile. "I don't consult anymore," he said, the words automatic after 3 years of practice. "I'm sure the Bureau has plenty of qualified profilers." Sarah opened the file folder and pulled out a photograph that made David's stomach drop. A crime scene, clinical and devastating, with details that spoke to a killer who understood exactly how to make death into art. 7 families targeted over the past 6 months, she said quietly, all single parents, all killed in their homes with their children present. "The children are taken and—" She paused, studying his face. "They're found 3 days later, alive but catatonic. We think he's building up to something bigger." David forced himself to look away from the photograph, back toward his front door where normal life waited, where Emma finished her cereal and worried about math tests instead of monsters. "I told you I don't do this anymore." But even as he said it, his mind was already working, cataloging details, building patterns. Sarah seemed to sense his internal struggle because she stepped closer, lowering her voice. The victims all fit a specific profile. Single parents between 30 and 40, high intelligence, children between 6 and 10 years old. She paused, letting the implications settle. "Dr. Matthews, I think you and Emma might be targets." Others hit David like a physical blow, and for a moment the carefully maintained distance between his old life and new one collapsed entirely. 3 years of routine, of safety, of believing he could keep them invisible, all of it crumbled with 5 simple words. He found himself studying Sarah's face with the intensity that had once made him legendary, noting the slight tension around her eyes, the way her hand rested near her weapon. "How do you know about Emma?" he asked quietly, and something shifted in Sarah's expression, a crack in her professional facade that revealed something deeper, more personal. She looked toward his front door, then back at him, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of confession. "Because I know you, David, better than you think." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a photograph, not a crime scene this time, but an old classroom photo, Harvard by the looks of it, and there in the front row sat a younger version of Sarah Chen alongside 24 other graduate students. Psychology 847, Advanced Criminal Behavior. "You probably don't remember me, but I remember every lecture you gave." The memory surfaced slowly, like something dredged up from deep water. Dr. Matthews' guest lectures at Harvard back when his reputation was growing and the FBI was just beginning to understand what they had in him. Sarah would have been maybe 25 then, brilliant and eager and probably harboring the same hero worship that had followed him through those golden years before everything went wrong. "You were Sarah Kim then," he said, and watched her nod. "You asked about the psychology of revenge killers during my lecture on victimology. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture he didn't like." "This isn't a coincidence, is it? You specifically requested this case." Sarah's professional mask slipped entirely, revealing something vulnerable and determined underneath. "I've been following your work for 12 years, David. Not just professionally, personally." She gestured toward the file folder still clutched in her hands. "This killer, he's not just targeting single parents, he's targeting people like you, brilliant minds who've been broken by the system. I think he knows who you are." The front door opened behind them, and Emma appeared in the doorway, still holding her cereal bowl and looking between the 2 adults with the sharp intelligence that reminded David painfully of her mother. "Daddy, you're standing weird," she announced with 8-year-old directness. "And you forgot to put on a jacket." David felt something twist in his chest as he looked at his daughter, really looked at her, seeing not just the light of his life but a potential target. Emma's dark hair caught the morning sunlight, and her serious brown eyes held the kind of intelligence that attracted predators. She was exactly the right age, exactly the right type, and living with exactly the kind of parent this killer seemed to prefer. "Baby, go finish getting ready for school," he said gently, surprised by how normal his voice sounded. Emma nodded and disappeared back inside, but not before offering Sarah a small wave that spoke to the kind of trusting nature that would make her an easy victim. David waited until he heard her footsteps on the stairs before turning back to Sarah. "What do you need from me?" They sat at David's kitchen table an hour later, crime scene photos spread between coffee cups and Emma's forgotten homework. David had walked his daughter to school personally, a deviation from routine that had earned him one of her searching looks, but no questions. Now, surrounded by evidence of methodical violence, he felt the familiar electricity of a mind made for this kind of work coming back to life. "The killer calls himself the Shepherd," Sarah said, pointing to symbols carved into the victim's front doors. "He leaves these markings at every scene, along with children's toys arranged in specific patterns." She slid a close-up photograph across the table. "Always 7 toys, always the same arrangement. Our analysts think it's some kind of countdown." David studied the image, his mind automatically cataloging details and cross-referencing patterns. 7 red blocks arranged in a perfect line, each one slightly smaller than the last. It was elegant in its simplicity, and that simplicity spoke to a killer with both artistic sensibilities and compulsive need for control. "He's not just counting down to 7 victims," David said slowly. "He's counting down to something specific. 7 has meaning for him." "Biblical significance?" Sarah suggested, but David was already shaking his head. There was something more personal about this pattern, something that went deeper than religious symbolism. He pulled out his laptop and began typing, accessing databases he'd sworn never to touch again. "No, this is trauma-based. 7 represents something from his childhood, probably the age when his formative trauma occurred." David's fingers moved across the keyboard with muscle memory, pulling up psychological profiles and cross-referencing with known offenders. The toys aren't just symbols, they're specific brands, specific types. He's recreating something from his own past. Sarah leaned forward, watching David work with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. There was admiration in her expression, but something else too. Something that reminded him of the way his graduate students used to look at him during those Harvard lectures. "You're seeing patterns the rest of us missed," she said quietly. "I always did." David pulled up a map and began marking locations, watching as a clear pattern emerged. "Your killer isn't choosing victims randomly. Look at this. Every home is within a 15-mile radius of the old Riverside Children's Home." He highlighted the building that had been demolished 5 years earlier. "I'm willing to bet our shepherd spent time there as a child." The revelation hung between them like a bridge, connecting David's analytical mind to Sarah's investigative resources. For the first time in 3 years, David felt the satisfaction of a puzzle clicking into place, of his unique abilities being put to use for something that mattered. But underneath the professional satisfaction was a growing dread. "Sarah," he said carefully, "if I'm right about the Riverside connection, and if this killer really is targeting people like me, Emma and I aren't just potential victims. We're probably next on his list." The security footage arrived at 2:30 that afternoon. 24 hours of grainy black and white images from the cameras outside Emma's elementary school. David sat in Sarah's field office, surrounded by federal agents, who treated him with the kind of respectful distance reserved for legends and loose cannons. He wasn't sure which category he fell into anymore, and from the careful way Sarah's colleagues watched him, neither were they. "There," David said, pointing to a figure lingering near the school fence during morning drop-off. "Same man, 3 different days. He's been watching her." The figure was careful to stay just out of clear camera range, but David's trained eye caught details others missed. The deliberate positioning, the patient observation, the body language of someone who knew exactly what he was hunting for. Sarah leaned over his shoulder to study the screen, close enough that he could smell her shampoo and feel the tension radiating from her body. "We could put Emma in protective custody," she suggested, but David was already shaking his head. He'd seen too many children broken by the system's version of protection, turned into prisoners in their own lives by well-meaning agents who didn't understand that sometimes the cure was worse than the disease. "He knows where we live, where she goes to school, probably where I buy groceries." David pulled up another image, this one showing the same figure outside their apartment building. Protective custody just changes the cage. It doesn't eliminate the threat. He turned in his chair to face Sarah directly, noting the way her professional mask slipped when their eyes met. "You said he's building up to something bigger. What if we're not just the next targets? What if we're the finale?" The question settled over the room like a weight, and David watched as Sarah's colleagues exchanged glances, heavy with implications he wasn't privy to. There was something they weren't telling him, some piece of information they'd held back. Sarah seemed to realize her team's discomfort because she gestured them toward the door. "Give us the room," she said quietly, and waited until they were alone before turning back to David. "There's something else about this case, something personal that I should have told you earlier." She pulled a file from her desk drawer, one that looked different from the official FBI folders. Older, more worn, with David's name written across the tab in handwriting he didn't recognize. "What is this?" he asked, but even as the words left his mouth, he was beginning to understand. Sarah opened the file to reveal newspaper clippings, academic articles, and what looked like years of carefully collected information about his career, his cases, his personal life. At the bottom of the stack was a photograph of his wife's funeral, taken from a distance but close enough to capture David's face, twisted with grief. "I've been following your career for 12 years, David. Not just professionally. Personally." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "I was there that day at Harvard when you talked about using pain as a tool for understanding killers. You said, the best profilers were the ones who'd learned to transform their own trauma into insight." She touched the edge of the funeral photograph. "When I heard about Kate, about what happened to her, I knew you'd disappear. But I also knew that someone like the shepherd would eventually draw you back out." David felt something cold settle in his chest as the full scope of Sarah's involvement became clear. "You didn't just request this case. You've been waiting for it." He stood up from the chair, needing distance, needing space to think. "How long have you known about the shepherd? How long have you been planning this?" "David, please." Sarah reached for him, but he stepped back, his mind racing through implications and connections he should have seen earlier. "It's not what you think. I didn't create this situation, but when the case came up, when I saw the pattern, I knew you were the only one who could stop him. And if I refused, if I'd kept my door closed and my life private?" David's voice was getting louder, 3 years of carefully controlled emotion beginning to crack. "Would you have just let him take Emma? Let him add her to his collection of traumatized children?" The accusation hung between them like a loaded weapon, and David watched Sarah's face cycle through guilt, defensiveness, and something that looked almost like desperation. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of a confession that would change everything between them. "No," she said simply, "because I love her almost as much as I love you." The words hit David like a physical blow, and for a moment the FBI field office, the case files, the entire world seemed to disappear around them. Sarah stood perfectly still, having crossed a line she could never uncross, her professional facade completely abandoned in favor of raw honesty. David found himself studying her face the way he used to study crime scenes, looking for truth in the details, trying to understand how he'd missed something so fundamental. "You don't even know me," he said quietly, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. Sarah had been watching him for 12 years, studying his work, following his life from a distance. She probably knew him better than he knew himself at this point. "I know you wake up at 5:30 every morning because you can't sleep past the time Kate used to leave for her early shift at the hospital," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I know you still set out 2 coffee cups every morning. And I know you've never thrown away the lipstick stain on the mug she used the last time she kissed you goodbye." David felt his carefully constructed walls crumbling with each word, each detail that proved just how closely Sarah had been watching. There was something both terrifying and oddly comforting about being so thoroughly seen, so completely understood by someone who'd chosen to care about him from a distance. "I know Emma draws pictures of a woman with dark hair who never has a face, and I know you keep those drawings in a box under your bed, even though they break your heart." Sarah stepped closer, close enough that David could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. "And I know that for 3 years you've been so focused on keeping her safe that you've forgotten what it means to actually live." The accusation stung because it was true. David had turned their life into a museum of safety, preserved and protected, but ultimately lifeless. Emma was growing up in a world of routine and caution, surrounded by love, but starved of the kind of adventures and connections that made childhood magical. He'd been so afraid of losing her that he'd forgotten to help her truly live. His phone buzzed against his hip, and David glanced down to see a text from the school. His blood turned to ice as he read the message. "Emma was picked up early today by her aunt. We have you listed as approving family pickups. Please confirm receipt of this message." David looked up at Sarah, and she must have seen something in his expression, because she was already reaching for her weapon. "Emma doesn't have an aunt," he said, his voice barely audible. He has her. The next 12 minutes passed in a blur of sirens, radio chatter, and the kind of coordinated law enforcement response that David remembered from his FBI days. Sarah's team moved with military precision, transforming the quiet field office into a command center crackling with urgency. David found himself at the center of it all, his mind shifting into a mode he hadn't accessed in 3 years. The cold, calculating mindset of a hunter tracking his prey. The school security footage shows a man in his 40s, average height, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, Agent Rodriguez reported from his position at the video monitors. He had official-looking paperwork and knew enough details about Emma's routine to convince the office staff. David studied the grainy footage, noting the way the man moved, the careful positioning that kept his face hidden from cameras. He's been planning this for weeks, David said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. Look at how he approaches the building. He knows exactly where every camera is positioned. This isn't opportunistic. It's the culmination of a long-term strategy. Sarah appeared at his elbow with a phone in her hand, her face grim. The call came from a burner phone, but we managed to trace the general location before he switched it off, she said. Industrial district, about 15 miles north. There's an abandoned warehouse complex that matches the profile for his previous kill sites. David was already moving toward the door before she finished speaking, but Sarah caught his arm. David, you can't go in there without backup. This is exactly what he wants. You, emotional and reckless and making mistakes. She pulled him around to face her, her grip firm but gentle. He took Emma to draw you out. If you go charging in there without a plan, you're giving him exactly what he's been working toward. David wanted to argue, wanted to push past her and tear the city apart with his bare hands until he found his daughter. But Sarah was right, and the part of his brain that had made him legendary was already working on the problem. The shepherd had Emma, but he hadn't killed her yet. That meant there was still time, still a chance to turn the hunter into the hunted. He'll call, David said, forcing his mind to work analytically instead of emotionally. He's got what he wants, but the game isn't over yet. He needs me to know he has her, needs me to understand the rules he's playing by. As if summoned by his words, David's phone began to ring. The caller ID showed only a number, but he knew who it was before he answered. "Hello, David," said the same voice that had whispered about red doors the night before. "I have something that belongs to you." David closed his eyes and let the familiar rhythm of psychological warfare wash over him. This was what he'd been made for, what he'd spent years perfecting. The shepherd might have Emma, but he'd just made the mistake of engaging David Matthews on his own terms. "What do you want?" David asked, aware that everyone in the room was listening, that Sarah's team was frantically trying to trace the call. "I want you to remember," the shepherd said, and there was something almost sad in his voice. "I want you to remember what it feels like to lose everything, because you've forgotten. You've gotten comfortable in your little life, David. You've forgotten what you're capable of." The words triggered something deep in David's memory, something familiar about the cadence and tone. This wasn't just any killer who'd researched his background. This was someone who knew him personally. Someone who'd been close enough to understand not just his professional methods, but his personal vulnerability. "Marcus," David said quietly, and the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line confirmed his suspicion. "Marcus Reed. I should have known." The name hit the room like a physical force, and David watched as Sarah's team erupted into motion, pulling files and cross-referencing databases with the desperate energy of people who'd just been handed the key to a puzzle they'd been working for months. But David barely noticed their activity, his mind racing through memories of his former colleague and friend, trying to understand how Marcus Reed had transformed from FBI profiler into serial killer. "You do remember," Marcus said, and there was genuine pleasure in his voice. "I wondered if you would. It's been so long since we worked together, since you abandoned all of us for your quiet little life." David could hear something in the background of the call, a child's voice, Emma's voice, though he couldn't make out the words. She was alive, and that was all that mattered right now. "Marcus, this isn't about me," David said, gesturing frantically for Sarah's team to keep tracing the call. Emma is innocent. She's just a little girl who's been through enough trauma already. He forced his voice to remain calm, professional, even as every instinct screamed at him to demand his daughter's immediate release. Trauma builds character, David. You taught me that. Marcus's voice carried a bitter edge that spoke to years of resentment and careful planning. Do you remember what you used to say about the best profilers, about how we needed to understand pain to truly understand killers? David did remember, and the memory made his stomach turn. He'd been so arrogant in those early years, so convinced that intellectual understanding could substitute for human empathy. I was wrong about that, David said quietly. Pain doesn't make us better at our jobs, it just makes us better at hiding from ourselves. He could hear Marcus breathing on the other end of the line, processing this admission. Whatever happened to you, whatever broke you, using Emma won't fix it. You're wrong, Marcus replied, and now his voice carried the kind of certainty that meant he was too far gone for reason. Emma is perfect. She's exactly the right age, exactly the right type. When I'm finished with her, she'll understand things that other children can't even imagine. She'll be special, like the others. David felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest as the full scope of Marcus's plan became clear. This wasn't just about revenge or some twisted attempt to reconnect with an old colleague. Marcus had spent 3 years creating a collection of traumatized children, believing in some demented way that he was giving them a gift of understanding the other children. David said, pieces falling into place. You're not killing them because you think you're saving them. You think you're making them into perfect profilers. Sarah appeared at his elbow with a tablet showing Marcus Reed's personnel file, a brilliant agent who'd been David's protégé until a particularly brutal case had sent him into psychological freefall. They see things now, David. They understand the darkness in ways that normal children never could. Marcus's voice was getting more animated, more excited, and David recognized the signs of a killer who was approaching his endgame. Emma will be the best of them all. She has your genetics, your potential. When I'm finished, she'll be everything you were meant to be before you got soft. David looked around the room at Sarah's team, all of whom were staring at him with a mixture of horror and expectation. They needed him to be the legend they'd heard about, the profiler who could get inside any killer's head and find the weakness that would bring them down. But this wasn't just any killer. This was someone who knew all of David's techniques, someone who'd learned from the master himself. Where do you want to meet? David asked, and watched as Sarah shook her head frantically. This was against every protocol, every rule of engagement the FBI had developed over decades of dealing with hostage situations. But David wasn't just any negotiator, and Marcus wasn't just any killer. The old Riverside Children's Home, Marcus said, confirming David's earlier theory, where it all began. Come alone, David. Come remember what you used to be. The Riverside Children's Home had been demolished 5 years earlier, but the foundation remained like a scar on the landscape, surrounded by overgrown weeds and the kind of urban decay that attracted neither development nor casual visitors. David sat in his car at the edge of the property, studying the ruins through binoculars, while Sarah's voice crackled through his earpiece. We have tactical teams positioned at every exit point, she said, though David could hear the tension in her voice. But he's had hours to prepare, and he knows this location better than we do. David lowered the binoculars and checked his weapon, a Glock 17 that felt both foreign and familiar in his hands. 3 years away from field work, but muscle memory was a powerful thing. Marcus spent 6 months here when he was 7 years old, David said, accessing the personnel file he'd memorized on the drive over. His parents were killed in a car accident, and he had no other family. The home was shut down for abuse allegations 2 years after he left. David could see movement in the ruins now, a figure that had to be Marcus, moving between the crumbling walls. David, he's not going to just hand Emma over, Sarah said, stating the obvious truth they'd both been avoiding. This has to end with him dead or completely broken, and he knows it. He's going to try to take you both with him. David nodded, understanding the psychology even as his heart rejected the implications. Marcus had spent 3 years building toward this moment, and he wasn't going to be satisfied with anything less than complete victory. "I need you to do something for me," David said quietly, knowing that Sarah would hear the finality in his voice. "If this goes wrong, if Marcus wins, I need you to promise me you'll take care of Emma. Not the system, not some foster family, you." He heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath through the earpiece, felt the weight of what he was asking. "David, don't talk like that. We're going to get her back, and we're all going to go home together." But there was something in Sarah's voice that suggested she understood the math as well as he did. Marcus Reed had been one of the FBI's best profilers before his breakdown, and he'd had 3 years to prepare for this confrontation. David opened his car door and stepped out into the evening air, feeling the weight of the weapon at his hip and the much heavier weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Emma was somewhere in those ruins, probably terrified, definitely in danger. Every minute he delayed was another minute Marcus had to solidify his position, or worse, to decide that the game wasn't worth playing anymore. "I'm going in," David said, and began walking toward the ruins before Sarah could argue. "If you don't hear from me in 30 minutes, come find us." The foundation of the old children's home was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a maze of crumbling walls and partially collapsed rooms that created dozens of potential hiding spots. David moved carefully, his weapon drawn but held low, listening for any sound that might indicate where Marcus was keeping Emma. The place smelled of decay and abandonment, but underneath that was something else, the lingering echo of institutional misery that places like this never quite lost. "David," Marcus's voice echoed from somewhere deeper in the ruins, impossible to pinpoint thanks to the acoustic properties of the broken walls. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come, that you'd send the FBI toys instead of facing me yourself." David didn't respond, knowing that Marcus was trying to draw him into conversation, trying to locate him through sound. "She's beautiful, your Emma," Marcus continued, his voice seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "Smart, too. She's been asking about you, wondering when Daddy will come to take her home." David felt his professional composure crack slightly at the mention of his daughter, but he forced himself to stay focused. Marcus was a master manipulator, and every word was calculated to provoke an emotional response. David rounded a corner and found himself in what had once been the home's central courtyard, now nothing more than a circle of broken concrete surrounded by the skeletal remains of dormitory walls. In the center of the space sat a small figure, Emma, alive and apparently unharmed, though even from a distance David could see that she was crying. "Daddy!" Emma's voice cut through the evening air like a knife, and David had to grip his weapon tighter to keep from running to her immediately. Because this was too easy, too obvious. Marcus Reed didn't make mistakes, and he certainly wouldn't leave his primary bargaining chip unguarded in an open space. "It's a trap," Sarah's voice crackled through his earpiece, confirming what David already knew. "Thermal imaging shows at least 2 other heat signatures in the area. Marcus isn't alone." David studied the scene more carefully, noting the way Emma was positioned exactly in the center of the courtyard, the way her restraints seemed designed more for show than actual security. This wasn't a hostage situation, it was a stage, carefully set for maximum psychological impact. "Hello, old friend," Marcus said, and this time his voice came from directly behind David. David turned slowly, keeping his weapon ready but not directly threatening, as Marcus Reed stepped out from behind a pile of rubble that should have been too small to conceal a grown man. 3 years had changed David's former colleague in ways that went far beyond the obvious signs of stress and sleep deprivation. Marcus's eyes held the kind of hollow intensity that David had seen in too many killers, the look of someone who'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "You look tired, Marcus," David said, keeping his voice calm and conversational, despite the weapon in Marcus's hand. "When's the last time you slept? Really slept, not just the few minutes you managed to grab between planning and execution." It was a profiler's trick, using observational details to establish psychological dominance, but Marcus smiled in response. "I've been sleeping better lately," Marcus replied. "Ever since I found my purpose again. Ever since I remembered what we used to be capable of." He gestured toward Emma with his free hand, and David noticed the slight tremor that suggested exhaustion, despite Marcus's claims. Do you remember our first case together? The Riverside Strangler? David did remember, though he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. It had been Marcus's first major case as a profiler, and David had been his mentor, guiding him through the psychological landscape of a killer who'd targeted children from broken homes. The irony of their current location wasn't lost on either of them. "You were brilliant on that case," David said, hoping to appeal to whatever remained of his former colleague's professional pride. "The profile you developed led us straight to him. You saved lives, Marcus. You were one of the good guys." Marcus's expression didn't change, but David caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the words had found their mark. "I was naive," Marcus corrected. "I thought catching monsters made me a hero. But the monsters are everywhere, David, and catching one just makes room for 2 more." He took a step closer, close enough that David could see the network of fine scars on Marcus's face, evidence of violence that had happened after his FBI career ended. "What happened to you?" David asked, genuinely curious despite the circumstances. "After you left the bureau, after you disappeared, what broke you this badly?" It was a dangerous question, the kind that could provoke violence from an unstable subject, but David needed to understand the psychology driving this confrontation. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his weapon still trained on David, but his attention seemingly focused on memories that caused visible pain. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 years of accumulated suffering. "I kept working cases even after they forced me to resign. Private consulting, cold cases, anything that would let me keep hunting." Marcus's free hand clenched into a fist, a gesture that spoke to barely controlled rage. "But the monsters I caught just got replaced by worse monsters. The children I saved just grew up to be broken adults. Nothing I did mattered." David felt a familiar chill of recognition as Marcus described a crisis of faith that David himself had experienced. The difference was that David had Emma to anchor him to something meaningful, while Marcus had been alone with his growing despair. "So you decided to become the monster," David said, and watched Marcus's expression shift from pain to something approaching satisfaction. "If you couldn't save the children, you'd make them stronger by traumatizing them yourself." "I'm not traumatizing them," Marcus snapped, the first real emotion he'd shown. "I'm giving them the gift of understanding. These children see the world as it really is now, not through the naive filter that gets them hurt later." His voice was rising, becoming more animated, and David recognized the signs of a killer approaching his breaking point. "And Emma?" David asked, gesturing toward his daughter, who was watching their conversation with the kind of terrified fascination that children showed when adults started acting unpredictably. "What gift are you planning to give her?" Marcus's expression softened as he looked at Emma, and for a moment, David saw something almost paternal in his former colleague's face. It was perhaps the most disturbing thing Marcus had shown him yet, the genuine belief that he was helping these children rather than destroying them. "Emma will be special," Marcus said, his voice dropping back to conversational levels. "She has your genetics, your potential for understanding the human psyche, but she also has innocence, purity that hasn't been corrupted by years of compromise and bureaucracy." He turned back to David, and his eyes held the kind of fervent certainty that made truly dangerous people impossible to reason with. "You're going to hurt her," David said simply, abandoning any attempt at psychological manipulation in favor of direct truth. "Whatever you think you're giving these children, you're actually breaking them. They're not becoming stronger or more insightful. They're becoming damaged." "You would say that," Marcus replied, his weapon shifting slightly to point more directly at David's chest. "You've gotten soft, David. You've forgotten what it takes to really see into the darkness. But Emma will remember. She'll carry the lessons I teach her for the rest of her life." David heard the sound of movement from somewhere behind him, Sarah's tactical team getting into position for an assault that would probably get everyone killed. Marcus heard it too, because his grip on his weapon tightened and his eyes began scanning the perimeter of their makeshift arena. "They're not going to let you walk away from this," David said quietly. "Even if you kill me, even if you hurt Emma, you know how this ends. The only question is how many people get destroyed before we reach that ending." Marcus smiled, and it was the saddest expression David had ever seen on another human being's face. "I stopped worrying about walking away a long time ago, David. This was always going to be the last lesson." He raised his weapon, and David knew with crystalline certainty that the conversation was over. But before Marcus could pull the trigger, Emma's voice cut through the tension like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "Mr. Marcus," she said, her 8-year-old voice carrying the kind of fearless directness that only children possessed. "My daddy isn't the one who hurt you." Both men turned toward Emma, who was struggling against her restraints with the determined persistence that David recognized from her mother. But it wasn't her physical efforts that caught their attention. It was the expression on her face, the kind of serious concentration she usually reserved for particularly difficult math problems. "Emma, don't talk to him," David said automatically, but she ignored him with the selective hearing that all children mastered by age 5. Instead, she fixed Marcus with the kind of steady gaze that made adults uncomfortable, the look of someone seeing more than they were supposed to see. "You're sad," Emma announced, as if this were a scientific observation rather than a psychological insight. "Not angry sad, but lonely sad. Like when I miss mommy but there's nobody to tell about it." Marcus's weapon wavered slightly, and David saw something flicker across his former colleague's face. Surprise, recognition, maybe even a hint of the man he used to be. "Emma, please stop talking," David said more urgently, aware that children's unpredictability could be as dangerous as it was disarming in situations like this. But Emma was on a roll, having apparently decided that Marcus was simply another adult who needed her help understanding his feelings. "My daddy gets lonely sad sometimes too," she continued, completely ignoring David's protests. "He thinks I don't notice, but I see him looking at mommy's picture and making that face you're making right now." She paused, tilting her head in the way that meant she was processing something complex. "Are you scared that nobody remembers you're a good person?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow, and David watched his former colleague's carefully constructed psychological armor crack in real time. For 3 years, Marcus had been building an identity around being a monster, a teacher of hard truths, someone who did necessary but unpleasant work. Emma's simple observation that he might still be fundamentally good was apparently more devastating than any FBI psychological profile. "I'm not a good person anymore," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction for the first time since David had arrived. "Good people don't do the things I've done." Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions, her small face scrunched in concentration. "My teacher says that good people sometimes do bad things when they're hurt really badly," she replied finally. "She says it doesn't make the bad things okay, but it doesn't make them not good people anymore either." David felt his breath catch as he watched his daughter, armed with nothing but 8 years of wisdom and a complete lack of adult cynicism, accomplished what the FBI's best negotiators probably couldn't have managed. Marcus was crying now, tears streaming down his face as 3 years of carefully suppressed grief finally found an outlet. The weapon in his hand dropped to his side, no longer a threat, but not yet completely abandoned. David could hear Sarah's voice in his earpiece, requesting permission to move in, but he held up a hand to indicate she should wait. "The children I hurt," Marcus said, his voice breaking on the words. "I told myself I was helping them, but I was just making them as broken as I am." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this were exactly the conclusion she'd been guiding him toward. "You can't fix being broken by breaking other people," she said with the kind of moral certainty that only children possessed. "But you can say you're sorry and try to help them get unbroken." She looked between Marcus and David, her expression hopeful. "Right, Daddy?" David felt something shift in his chest as he looked at his daughter, really looked at her, seeing not just the light of his life but a person with her own wisdom, her own strength, her own capacity for healing others. For 3 years he'd been so focused on protecting her from the world's darkness that he'd forgotten she might have her own light to offer. "Right, baby," he said quietly, and for the first time in 3 years, David Matthews began to believe that healing might actually be possible. Marcus Reed dropped his weapon completely, the metal clattering against broken concrete as he sank to his knees in the center of the ruined courtyard. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the evening suspended in violence and possibility, and David heard the coordinated movement of Sarah's tactical team finally moving into position around the perimeter. "I can't undo what I've done," Marcus said, his voice barely audible above the evening wind. "Those children, their families, I destroyed so many lives, trying to save something that was already gone." He looked up at David with eyes that held the kind of exhausted clarity that came after years of self-deception finally crumbled. David holstered his weapon and moved toward Emma, who was still struggling with restraints that turned out to be more theatrical than functional. As he freed his daughter, he kept one eye on Marcus, noting the complete collapse of aggressive body language. The way his former colleague had folded in on himself, like a building whose foundation had finally given way. "The families deserve justice," David said, as he gathered Emma into his arms, feeling the solid warmth of her small body against his chest. "But maybe they also deserve to know that the man who hurt them remembered how to be sorry." Emma wrapped her arms around his neck with the fierce intensity of someone who'd spent hours believing she might never see him again. "Daddy, I was really scared," she whispered against his ear, and David felt 3 years of protective instincts crystallize into something approaching peace. She was safe, she was whole, and somehow she'd managed to save not just herself, but potentially everyone involved in this confrontation. "I know, baby, I was scared too." David looked over Emma's head at Marcus, who was now surrounded by federal agents but not resisting arrest. "But you were braver than anyone should have to be, and you did something amazing tonight." Sarah appeared at David's elbow, her face showing the kind of relief that came after a crisis had been resolved, without the worst-case scenario coming to pass. "We need to get Emma to a hospital for evaluation," she said, though her tone suggested this was more protocol than genuine concern. "And we'll need detailed statements from both of you about everything that happened here." David nodded, understanding that the official aftermath of tonight's events would stretch on for months. But as they walked away from the ruins of the Riverside Children's Home, Emma's hand securely held in his own, David felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the sense that tomorrow might actually be better than today. Marcus Reed would face justice for his crimes, but he would also receive the kind of psychological help that might prevent other brilliant minds from following the same dark path. "Sarah," David said as they reached the cars where paramedics were waiting to check Emma over, "about what you said earlier, about following my career, about caring about us." He paused, looking down at Emma, who was chattering excitedly with one of the paramedics about the adventure she'd just survived. "I meant every word," Sarah replied simply, "both the professional admiration and the personal feelings. I know it's complicated, and I know you need time to process everything that's happened, but I wanted you to know that you're not alone anymore. Either of you." David felt Emma's hand squeeze his own, and when he looked down, he saw her watching the adults with the kind of knowing expression that suggested she understood more about the evening's emotional undercurrents than anyone had given her credit for. "Can Miss Sarah come have dinner with us tomorrow?" Emma asked, with the directness that had disarmed a serial killer just minutes earlier. "I want to show her my drawings, and Daddy makes really good spaghetti." David looked at Sarah, who was trying unsuccessfully to hide a smile, and felt the last of his 3-year isolation begin to crumble. "I think that sounds like a very good idea," he said, and meant it. 6 months later, David Matthews stood in the FBI Academy at Quantico, facing a room full of young agents who looked at him with the same mixture of respect and curiosity he remembered from his teaching days at Harvard. But this time was different. This time he wasn't just the legendary profiler sharing war stories. He was a man who'd lost everything, found it again, and learned something valuable in the process. "The most dangerous assumption we can make as profilers," he said, clicking to a slide that showed Marcus Reed's booking photo, "is that understanding monsters makes us immune to becoming them ourselves." The room was silent, hanging on every word. These young agents had all heard the story of the Shepard case, but hearing it from David himself carried a weight that no textbook could match. Marcus Reed was one of the best profilers the Bureau ever produced. His psychological insights saved dozens of lives over the course of his career. But when his personal trauma became overwhelming, when he lost faith in the system he'd devoted his life to serving, he made a choice that transformed him from hero to villain. David paused, letting the implications settle over his audience. The lesson isn't that we should stop trying to understand killers, or that psychological insight is dangerous. The lesson is that we need support systems, connections to something larger than ourselves, people who can remind us who we are when the darkness threatens to swallow us whole. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of Emma's latest drawing, a picture of 3 people holding hands in front of a house, all of them smiling. "My daughter taught me something that night that I'd forgotten during years of hunting monsters," David continued. "She taught me that healing is possible, that redemption is real, and that sometimes the most profound insights come not from analyzing criminal behavior, but from remembering what it means to be human." The agents were taking notes, but David could see that some of them were really listening, really understanding. After the lecture, David found Sarah waiting for him in the hallway, looking professional in her FBI windbreaker, but smiling with the warmth he'd grown to associate with home. They'd been taking things slowly, building a relationship on the foundation of shared purpose and genuine affection, rather than crisis and adrenaline. "How did it go?" she asked, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the parking lot where Emma was waiting in the car, probably reading a book that was several grade levels above her age range. "Good," David said, surprised by how natural teaching felt again, how satisfying it was to share knowledge that might help other agents avoid Marcus's fate. "I think they understood that profiling isn't just about catching killers. It's about staying human while we do it." They reached the car to find Emma in the back seat, surrounded by coloring books and science journals in a combination that perfectly captured her unique approach to childhood. She looked up as they approached, her face lighting up with the kind of joy that made everything else worthwhile. "How was school?" David asked, settling into the driver's seat while Sarah claimed shotgun with the ease of someone who belonged there. "Good," Emma replied, then paused with the dramatic timing she'd inherited from her mother. "I told my class about how sometimes people do bad things because they're hurt, and Mrs. Peterson said I should write a story about it for the school magazine." David caught Sarah's eye in the rearview mirror, and they shared a look of pride mixed with mild concern about raising a child who was already showing signs of following in her father's psychological footsteps. "That sounds like a wonderful idea," Sarah said, turning around to engage Emma more directly. "Maybe you could write about how understanding and forgiveness can help heal people who've been hurt." Emma nodded enthusiastically, already reaching for one of her notebooks to begin planning her story. As they drove home through the Virginia countryside, David felt the kind of contentment he'd thought was lost forever. Emma was thriving, showing no lasting trauma from her ordeal and instead seeming to have gained confidence from surviving something genuinely frightening. Sarah had become not just a partner, but a true member of their small family, bringing her own strengths and perspectives to their daily life. And David himself had found a way to use his gifts that felt sustainable, meaningful, connected to something larger than his own pain, teaching the next generation of profilers, consulting on cases that truly needed his expertise, building a life that honored both his professional calling and his responsibilities as a father. The Shepherd case had ended with Marcus Reed receiving a life sentence and psychological treatment that might eventually help him find some measure of peace. The children he'd traumatized were all receiving specialized care, and several were already showing remarkable resilience. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a human one, messy, complicated, and ultimately hopeful. As they pulled into their driveway, Emma, already chattering about the story she planned to write, David allowed himself to believe that tomorrow would be even better than today. Because sometimes, when you stopped running from the darkness and started learning to carry your own light, healing became not just possible but inevitable. And in the end, that was the most important lesson of all.